The story of the teapot really begins with its necessity. What is a teapot? It's a vessel meant to infuse tea leaves in hot water, but obviously nowadays most of us are familiar with tea bags. And the traditional teapot does come in many different forms and designs nowadays. When we think of a teapot, we typically think of comfort and warmth, but we also think of the design suggesting humanness, right? A head, arms, and a body. Think of that little song, I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Teapots also relate to the idea of ritual and community. And yes, sometimes we think of a tea party like this or like that. But who was the first person to come up with a design for a teapot? And when were they first used? Teapots have existed for over 400 years, and tea itself has played a dramatic role in social and economic stories of various countries and cultures and how those countries relate to each other. So there's a theory. The shape of the teapot most likely came from wine jugs and ceramic kettles from China, because at some point tea was being shipped to Europe from China in the 17th century. And this photo here on the left, this is actual traditional European teapot. Some people also believe the shape of the teapot might have been inspired by coffee pots found in Islamic countries, and we have some examples here. When you look at these designs, you can see how they mimic what we recognize in a traditional teapot. So let's go to Europe, 17th century. Tea and the porcelain clay used to create the teapots were highly valued in the West. Tea was expensive and it was a luxury product. So the common tea plant was first cultivated in China in the 4th century, long time ago. It was actually brought to China from India. And tea making was introduced into Japan in the early 9th century. And at that time, tea was considered medicinal in China and Japan for over the next 500 years. It wasn't used as something, as a way to relax. It was drank in order as medicine. And Japanese, the demand for teapots grew because they had this new form of pottery. And the Chinese and Japanese were no longer drinking tea for ceremonial purposes, and the beverage was not thought as medicine. And so there were Chinese scholars and intellects, they started designing teapots. And this is an example of Yizing pots. It was a traditional type of teapot made in China. And eventually tea, the drinking of tea, spread throughout Asia into all these different parts. And then eventually it moved into Europe. So when we think of traditional tea, sometimes we think of Europe, but it really started in Asia. So at some point, the trade of tea, it creates some really interesting cross-cultural expressions in the teapot design. Western images, for example, these two teapots, Western images were being depicted on Chinese porcelain clay that was being made in China for the Western European market. It's a very interesting idea. But then actually the trend reverses because at some point Europeans want to drink their tea out of teapots that actually have images influenced by Asian culture. It's just interesting. It's being flip-flopped. As well here, this teapot was created in Europe, yet it had designs on the outside that mimic Asian aesthetics. And the earliest teapots arrived in England from China in the 1600s, and the design was based on those Yixing teapots, and these are some examples here. These teapots would later influence European ceramic artists. So designs start to emerge. Since tea was too valuable to be used in large vessels, small-scale teapots had to be created first. And then, as tea became more well-known and imported into the market, the familiar middle-sized teapot became the norm, and that's what we typically see today. The first ceramic teapots were heavy with short spouts, and they broke easily in transport. So, the East India Company, these were the people shipping the tea to Europe, paid Chinese artists to create teapots out of porcelain, like over here. And porcelain was stronger, it lasted longer, and it could survive seawater and that sea air as it was being transported to Europe. And yes, the East India Company, we know of that from the Pirates of the Caribbean films. So, companies were commissioning people to create teapots in China. And actually, the work, as I mentioned, it would use European stereotypes and aesthetics, which is interesting because it was being created in China. So the teapots from China were meant to hold large amounts of one type of tea. They were meant to be used for a specific tea, and you actually would drink the tea out of the spout. So really the teapot was meant for one person. But traditional teapots in England and Europe were smaller. That was so the tea flavor could be more concentrated and controlled. And then the tea would be poured into several cups so it could be shared. Did you know that tea was not always a popular drink in England? We tend to connect it to England. A long time ago, the popular drink was ale, which is basically like a beer. So when the government cut the tax on tea and grain harvests because the harvesting of grain became really poor, they weren't harvesting a lot of grain, the size of teapots increased, and that was so more tea could be brewed at once. The teapot design continues to evolve. Eventually, in 1708, a method of making porcelain was discovered in Dresden, Germany, of all places, where they began creating teapots that were inspired by Chinese designs. Again, it all started in Asia, and these designs became spread out through Europe as people were enjoying tea. Now you're thinking, what about Japanese teapots? Well, their designs were a little bit different, and they do still influence ceramic artists today when they're designing teapots. But Japanese tea is brewed and served typically in tea bowls like this. So instead of the teapot, is really just meant to hold that hot water. So it didn't really influence European designs of teapots. And the meaning of a teapot, it was associated with your class or your rank in society. And for a long time in Europe, tea drinking was for the upper classes because they had time to drink it, right? They didn't have much to do, so they had time to sit around and relax and drink tea. But as teapots became cheaper to produce, the middle class had money to spend. The middle class had emerged and they wanted to copy the lifestyle of the upper class, so they drank tea. This is where the idea of afternoon tea comes from. Now, tea in America is very interesting. I mean, we can think about the 1700s with the Boston Tea Party. We can also think about the current political climate of the Tea Party that exists. And America kind of combined Asia and Western influences. So teapots in 18th century America were imported from England, but also imported from China. And they were really looking at the status as well. So the basic design of the teapot has hardly changed in 400 years. It still has a body, a spout, a lid, and a handle. That has pretty much stayed the same.